It was 2006 and I had just graduated from high school. At 17, I was definitely very moody and easily bothered. My two younger sisters, aged 9 and 12, were generally the root cause of my daily emotional tidal waves. Part of the reason that I was so angry was that it was summer, and I should have been with my friends celebrating our graduation. But Dad had declared that the four of us were going to be going camping every weekend. He'd bought one of those giant tents that are the size of an actual room. You know the ones. You can stand upright, they sleep 10 people, and they even have different areas inside for privacy. Naturally, I declined because I had anything better to do than be stuck with the three of them in a forest for 2 nights a week. Dad told me that was fine and I could skip this trip, but I would be in the company of my Aunt Eleanor, who would be staying in our house that weekend. Spending the weekend with Aunt Eleanor was the equivalent of banging chalkboard erasers together. So, begrudgingly, I threw some clothes, my toothbrush, iPod, magazines, and a charger in my bag. Amelia packed only a teddy bear, so I helped her gather some extra clothing, despite her pleas that she only needed the outfit that she was wearing. Dad busied himself packing the truck with supplies from his shop. The new tent, tarps, cooler, an axe, and even a chainsaw, which I honestly thought was a bit overkill. But 3 hours later, we were on the road. Our city wasn't big, nor was it small town living. It was somewhere in the middle. I was used to growing up in the woods. I grew up being able to actually see the stars in the backyard. I knew how to handle myself if I saw a bear. But at the same time, we were always close to the stores, the hospital, and we had plenty of neighbors. We were never truly alone. So whenever we would drive into the really small towns that were hours outside of our city, it was apparent how the pace of life was really slowed down, and how manners were more important. People talked to you differently. It was like they had all the time in the world, and honestly, it kind of gave me the creeps. After 6 hours of driving, Dad spotted a large sign for a nearby campground. There were a couple more hours of sunlight, but we were definitely behind, and unless we wanted to pitch a tent on the side of the road, we had to hurry and fill the coolers with food for the next couple of days. We'd only passed a handful of cars during the last hour, and it was clear that we were now in the boonies. But the last stop before heading into the woods was this really small, decrepit convenience store right on the edge of town. We pulled in, happy to walk before the final stretch of the drive. Amelia eyed the Slurpee picture in the store window and started running to make her usual cup of frozen syrup. Beside the cash register, Lauren found a basket of packaged muffins and a sign that said fresh baked, $1 each. I don't know how they were fresh baked if they were packaged in plastic, but Lauren would never pass up a blueberry muffin. I noticed that nobody was attending the cash register, but the battered sign was flipped to say, "Be back in 5 minutes," so we assumed that the owner was maybe in the washroom. I guess in towns this small, you just trust people not to steal your stuff when you have to go and do your business. I'll admit, I contemplated stealing the bills from the tip jar. It would have been pretty easy, but who was I kidding? I was too chicken. Plus, the owner was probably watching us from a monitor in the back room, or the bathroom. I really hoped it wasn't the latter, but you never know. People are weird. Dad grabbed a cart and Lauren jumped in to be pushed around. Amelia immediately demanded that she be placed inside as well. He tipped the cart on its front wheels so the girls felt like they were on a carnival ride, and howled as Dad drove them around the store at high speed. As annoyed as I was with them most of the time, it did make me happy to hear them laughing, As Dad pushed my sisters around, Amelia pointed to boxes of cookies, cereal, chocolate milk, those little bags of pre-mixed candy, and of course, marshmallows, the only camping staple. Dad threw in some beef jerky and didn't really seem that worried about any other sustenance. Had I left it up to them, he would have left the store with nothing but sugar and a package of salted leather. Without Mom here, it was my responsibility to make sure that my sisters didn't go on a 3-day sugar binge with no protein or hydration. I threw bottled water, regular milk, a bag of apples, frozen burgers, and a package of cheese in my cart. I also grabbed Band-Aids, mosquito repellent, and sunscreen. Then I noticed that, as quick as their laughter had made me happy when we got here, I was now annoyed that I was the only person doing any responsible shopping for our little family trip. I was mad at my mom for not being here to take this responsibility, and more annoyed with my dad for not noticing my annoyance. I didn't even want to come in the first place. But my thoughts were quickly interrupted by the creepy man that I accidentally pushed my cart into. For such a tiny store, I don't know how I didn't see him come into my peripheral vision. I assumed that the wheel of my cart had hit his ankle, which must have been painful, but when I looked up to apologize, he was staring at me with what I can only describe as the most sinister smile that I had ever seen. His lips were parted in such a small slit that they looked like a thin line of paint. The face that he was making looked uncomfortable, but mostly it looked unnatural. And his black eyes, they were showing no emotion, indicating that the smile was fake. He said, "Feel free to run into me like that again, if you want." At the time, I didn't realize how inappropriate or strange his comment was. I think I may have believed that he was trying to be funny or make me more comfortable for having run into him, but I was far from it. Despite the heat outside, he was wearing a black trench coat. His gray shirt underneath was grossly stained, and I wasn't sure if it was sweat, oil, or something else. He was maybe around 50 years old, but it was pretty hard to tell. Chunks of his hair were missing, revealing patches of reddened and peeling scalp where he'd been sunburned. The hair that he did have was long, brown, and extremely greasy. He clearly hadn't showered or at least washed his hair for weeks. I had to hold my breath to hide my disgust for his smell. I was trying to be polite, but it was a mixture of body odor and old garbage, and I don't think I could hide the look on my face of how gross it was. "I'm sorry," I mumbled and veered my cart to the left. I could see Dad and the girls in the far back corner of the store, heading for the Slurpee machine. Amelia was still screeching with laughter, and the sound of the machine's freezer was making a really loud buzz. And I knew that Dad hadn't heard the stranger's bizarre statement to me. As I tried to go past him, the creepy man grabbed onto my cart with one large hand, forcing me to stay in the aisle with him. His filthy fingers intertwined around the hard metal, and dried dirt was scraping off his skin and crumbling on top of my food. Then he snatched my bag of apples and started inspecting them. "These are rotten," he said. He smiled, showing streaks of black between each tooth. Clearly, he didn't floss. He squeezed one of the apples over my cart, and I watched as the round fruit turned into mush in his hand. He let the slimy brown interior drip down his arm, and it went onto my food. Plop, plop, plop. The mushy flesh dripped onto the milk jug, as well as the cheese. It smelled awful, like unpicked apples that were left long after the harvest. I was speechless. Should I thank him? Grab a new bag of apples? I hadn't noticed that they were rotten, but the way that he had squished it with one hand was extremely unsettling. I apologized once again for running into him, but he ignored me and simply reached in to grab another one of my items. He held the block of cheese slices close to my face, and he asked, "Fancy some maggots?" Then, like a cackling witch, he threw his head back and he started laughing at me. That was when I noticed the small white spots squirming around inside of the cheese. He tossed the package to me, and in reflex, I caught it. When a few of the maggots poured into my hand from a hole in the packaging, I screamed and dropped it. Dad was at my side in seconds, analyzing the squished apple, the maggot-covered cheese, the horrible smell from the disturbing man, and the tears that were beginning to fall from my eyes out of embarrassment, but mostly fear. Before Dad could say anything, the man twisted the plastic off the milk jug. He closed his eyes like he was about to smell a beautiful flower, and he inhaled deeply. For the first time, his face showed genuine emotion with a smile that formed creases around his eyes. And just like he'd done with the apples, he declared that the milk too was spoiled. "Oh, so rotten. So lovely and so rotten," he said. Then he poured the contents onto the floor. The milk was so old that it was no longer liquid. Curdled white chunks slowly moved downward with gravity. As a glob hit the floor, it splashed my face, and I almost vomited from the smell of the expired dairy. Amelia interrupted the scene that looked more like a food fight at that point, declaring that her rainbow Slurpee tasted funny and she didn't like the dark glitter that was floating in the ice. "Dark glitter?" my dad asked, confused. Inspecting the cup, he saw that the summery treat was riddled with huge flecks of mold. Seconds later, Lauren appeared behind us to see what all the commotion was about. Her curiosity ended when she ripped open her blueberry muffin to take a bite, and a cockroach crawled out from its embedding in the pastry. She threw the muffin on the floor, and several more cockroaches burst out, crawling fast towards Amelia, who began screaming. Dad hoisted her off the ground away from the bugs, stunned, as this creepy man was clearly delighting in the horror on my sister's faces. He started doing what I can only describe as a sort of happy tap dance, right in the middle of the aisle. And that was when I noticed that he wasn't wearing any shoes and his feet were cut up and bloodied. His dancing moved him down the aisle towards a back room with a curtain covering the entryway. As he parted the curtain and disappeared, we could hear him singing from somewhere in the dark. He was singing, "Lovely, but not rotten. No good. No good for me." Dad took Lauren's hand, made a shushing noise, and motioned for all of us to leave the store immediately. All too happy to get out of there, we left our stuff and piled back into his truck. As he started the engine, the creepy man emerged from the store, carrying a basket of peaches, and he ran towards us. We locked the cab doors, but he didn't come close enough to touch them. He simply set the basket of peaches down on the pavement and began stomping on them with his bare feet, happily cheering about how lovely and rotten the peach juice would be.